last thing before we get to questions and answers. And you're first, if you still have your question. So I know that the narrative about chimps, which you just alluded to, is that they are warlike and aggressive, et cetera, et cetera. And that seemed to fit the human narrative of ourselves, particularly during the colonial period, probably when you know, various Europeans were encountering chimps in the wild and so forth in Africa. That almost seems, it seems to me that that was very convenient for them, and they liked that idea because it was all about conquest through power, etc. Has any of that is a very strong narrative, I think, throughout the history of studying primates. When bonobos came onto the scene, did that cause a big sort of existential you know, concern for the people who held that narrative?
Well, it brought about a complete reevaluation of primate studies. And for one thing, historically, primate studies have been very male-dominated, meaning male scientists describing primate behavior. And of course, when they go out into the wild, they're looking at what the male primates do more than the females. And so that brought about a narrative of male species kind of dragging along the females evolutionarily through time, which there's a lot of fault with that idea, because it, you know, it takes both sexes in order to have species. And believe me, with chimpanzees and bonobos, both the female behaviors are extremely important and extremely relevant. That's why every time we have a new experiment, we you know, work with a chimpanzee that we want to see how information spreads from one to another, we'll choose a high-ranking female. Every time, almost every time. Because they're the ones who transmit a lot of information, because the offspring have such long lives. So I think that there's a lot to that. So it speaks to how we have to, and we still have to reevaluate. We'll always have to reevaluate. Science is never done. We haven't figured everything out, certainly. But we have to look at the behaviors of these animals and not impose our own behaviors on them and say, well, they do that because we do this. So there's an inherent, it's like an a priori bias or something, where you just assume that it's going to be this way because chimpanzees are male-dominated, and our society tends to be patriarchal in most societies. And so that doesn't necessarily have to be a parallel that we cling to. Bonobos, as recently as 100 years ago, Robert M. Yerkes, the founder of the Yerkes Primate Research Center, had this little chimpanzee, and he's like, this one acts very differently than the other ones. She doesn't make the same vocalizations, her behaviors are completely different, and he never knew. It was only after his death that they realized from photos and looking at all the behavior that this was actually a bonobo. And he thought that he had a chimpanzee this entire time. So, and he did, he had many chimpanzees, but they somehow procured, probably from something awful in Africa when they used to take apes from their mothers, this bonobo, and thought it was a chimp. And so now that we know more that there's this entirely different species, I mean, most of the time when I discuss bonobos with people, I don't know if you've all ever even heard of them, most people have never heard of bonobos. And if you were to see them at the zoo, you would say, oh, there's a chimp. It's kind of a skinny, longer-legged chimp. They stand upright a little bit more. Some people have thought that maybe they're even better models, if you will, for looking at early human behavior, because they stand upright more often. They're just as intelligent. Their behaviors are such that maybe they're, said if we had discovered them sooner, maybe we would look at things a little bit differently. So we're lucky to have both, but it kind of turned everything on its head. And also there are a lot more female primatologists now, and that has done our field a great service to have that balance there, where women are going out to the field and saying, wait a minute, you know, females are doing really interesting stuff too here, and that started to happen a lot in the 60s and 70s, which is very much in line with the whole kind of, you know, sexual revolution and feminist movement. So, yeah.
All right. Yeah. Okay, so questions.
How closely can chimpanzees in jail be equated to chimpanzees in the wild? Because you have also, it was mentioned by one of you two, that introducing a chimpanzee into a group that you have in this confined area, it was accepted. But in the wilds, a chimpanzee from another tribe or group coming into is usually looked at as an invasion of this territory, and they're pulled
Absolutely, and I'm so glad that you asked that. It is really important that we as primatologists take a look at the differences in captive animals versus wild animals. And Franz has argued, and I agree with him, that even though they're in a captive environment, that doesn't mean that their natural behaviors all cease to exist. Certainly, that's why I was saying earlier about domestication, things like that. So we still see a lot of the cognitive behaviors and similar behaviors that we would in the wild. There are a lot of parallels. They line them up a lot to try to make sure that we're not overgeneralizing captive studies. But you're right, in the wild, if a female chimpanzee, she would introduce herself very slowly into a group in order to avoid being harmed. But the males will systematically go out and sometimes find other males and annihilate them one by one until there are no males left in that group, and then they get all those females. So you have to be careful with those assumptions. I call what you're describing the "it depends" clause, because with Knuckles, he was placed a lot with other chimpanzees for socialization, but they were careful about who they put him with. But they did seem to have an understanding that he was different. So he's getting to be about this big at the last time I was working with him. But they still seem to treat him like a large baby when we compare his behaviors to other. Had Knuckles been born in the wild, I don't know that he would have survived. However, some field researchers of many primate species have noticed that some infirmed individuals in monkeys and apes are treated with a great amount of tolerance. They're allowed to be in the group. They reproduce, even though they might be missing limbs. They might still be high-ranking mothers. And so it depends on the situation with all animals, not just primates. But it's an important distinction to note. We have to be constantly aware and very cognizant of. And many anthropologists don't like captive research for that reason. They're like, you've introduced too many variables. You're giving them all the food that they need. You're giving them, and they're in a confined. We give them as much space and comfort and what have you as we can. But there is a difference there, and I think it's important to note that. That's why captive studies and wild studies need to complement each other.
And this other thing that you brought up about, I don't know this other animal name,
Bonobos?
I don't hear that well to where I know what letters come together. But I've seen studies and indications that maybe that river, that they're on the other bank of a river, maybe they were all chimpanzees at one time. The river separated them hundreds of thousands of years earlier. The same species is now doing different things because of that.
Yes, something like that. They wouldn't have been chimpanzees, best we can see, but they would have been they still are very similar to each other. So there was a species that was very that was a species that existed in that place, which is now like the Democratic Republic of Congo, that became separated geographically. And this is how speciation occurs over time. And so that's absolutely true. And so we see and that could very well play into the bonobos' behavior. If they have more resources available to them on their side of the river,
Right.
they're going to be less likely to evolve competitive tendencies.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's very true.
Yeah.
Good question.
Thank you.
Yes. Sure.
Well, I have a billion questions right now,
Billion.
but I'll limit them to just 12 really. But I have to say, just parenthetically, when you talked about the